Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the latest fantabulous episode of The Thoughtful Bro, live streaming on a mighty blaze across the interwebs to Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and more. The Thoughtful Bro, as you know, is here every Tuesday at 2 to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. And A Mighty Blaze is an all-volunteer initiative to help writers reach readers virtually during COVID and beyond. And if you watch this show, you will know that usually at this point in the show, I say that we never ask for your money on A Mighty Blaze. But today, I'm going to say something a little bit different, which is that we've been around for 3 years on A Mighty Blaze, and we are actually, for the first time, running a GoFundMe campaign. Here's 30 seconds about A Mighty Blaze. As I said, we've been up and running for 3 years since the pandemic started. We are a collective of 35 creative professionals. We bring you 9 different shows every week. We've done hundreds of interviews that have been watched hundreds of thousands of times. And we do it all out of the goodness of our own hearts and the desire to be good literary citizens and spread the word about great books and great authors. But it does cost money to produce these shows. There are very super unsexy costs related to producing A Mighty Blaze, which include things like platform hosting, content creation, app subscriptions, and social media, and so on. So we're going to put a link in the chat to go to our GoFundMe page. If you have just a few dollars to spare, and you can send it our way, that will help us keep the blaze lit for another year or so, and we would so appreciate it. Now, moving on from the GoFundMe pitch, if you have another amount of money that you'd like to spend, please spend it on fantastic books by today's guest, Tananarive Due, whose latest book is called The Wishing Pool. It is a collection of stories that are creepy, horrific, terrifying, full of fairy tale, noir genre twists. The book is getting rave reviews, and I will get to that in a moment. But if you do have questions for Tananarive, please put them in the chat, and we will ask them at the end of the show. But to introduce our guest today, Tananarive Due is an award-winning author who teaches Black horror and Afrofuturism at UCLA. She is an executive producer on Shudder's groundbreaking documentary, Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror. Among other credits, she and her husband and collaborator, Stephen Barnes, wrote A Small Town for season 2 of Jordan Peele's The Twilight Zone on Paramount+. And together, they also co-host a podcast, which I love. I've been binge listening to it all weekend. Life Writing, Writing for Your Life. She is a leading voice in Black speculative fiction and has been for more than 20 years. She won an American Book Award, an NAACP Image Award, and a British Fantasy Award. Her books include Ghost Summer, My Soul to Keep, and The Good House. And she and her late mother, civil rights activist Patricia Stevens Due, co-authored Freedom in the Family, a mother-daughter memoir of the fight for civil rights. Now, her latest book, her first in 7 years, is called The Wishing Pool. The great, the legendary, the epic LeVar Burton had this to say about The Wishing Pool. I make no secret of the fact that I am both a lover of short fiction as well as a huge Tananarive Due fan. Her writing never fails to remind me that some of the most deliciously twisted imaginations in literature are possessed by some of the sweetest humans on the planet.
I've got him fooled. I've got him so fooled. Wow. No.
and Kirkus, and Kirkus never does this. I feel like Kirkus truly lost it about this book. This is from the often crusty, often judgmental Kirkus said, quote, "Holy hell. These 14 stories from author and film historian Due might scare even the most dauntless horror fans to death. It is a patchwork of stories that somehow manages to be both graceful and alarming and put fresh eyes on the unspeakable." Wow, from Kirkus. So Tananarive Due, welcome to the show. It is so great to have you here.
Great to be here. I pretty much wanted to faint when I saw that review because Kirkus has a reputation for being just sort of polite,
business-like.
Suck. This isn't a complete waste of money. No.
It's true. It's scary what you read in there. But this one, I think I was saying in the green room, I think there was even an exclamation point in the review. I mean, it was startling how great this review was. So congratulations on that. And I would just say, looking at the chatter online, this book is being very well received.
I'm so glad. You never know when you publish a short story collection because, well, first of all, it's not easy to publish a short story collection. I don't mind saying that when I published my first short story collection back in, I think, 2015,
Hmm.
Go Summer, I got $1,000 advance, which for books is not a whole lot of
Right.
advance. And kind of felt like I was lucky to find anyone to publish it. So to come back these years later, have a great house like Akashic behind it, and these reviews it's a little stunning, actually.
It's awesome. It's totally awesome. So tell us how this book came about.
Well, absolutely. I love short stories. I don't know how many of your listeners are writers
A lot.
or want to be writers, but my opinion is if you're writing, you're a writer, whether or not you've been published. Short stories are the way I began. Even though ironically, I never saw one published before my first novel came out. I did sell one years before my first novel came out. They just went out of business. The magazine went out of business before they could publish it. But that was where I cut my teeth. That was where I learned how to write full scenes. That's where I learned beginning, middle, and end. And over the past few years, the reason it's taken me so long to publish a book since 2015 is two reasons. One, I was working on a novel, The Reformatory, which comes out in October, and we'll talk about that later. But I can't even really blame The Reformatory. The main thing was I was trying to learn how to write screenplays. And more than that, I was trying to learn how to play the game in Hollywood to sell
Yeah.
screenplays. And I've made tremendous inroads in the past, just even 3 to 4 years. I mean, starting with that Twilight Zone episode, a couple of episodes of a Black horror anthology called Horror Noir, which appears on Shudder and AMC Plus, not to be confused with the documentary Horror Noir: History of Black Horror, which I was a talking head and executive producer for. But yeah, lots of time working on scripts. And from time to time, an editor would write to me and say, hey, I'm doing an anthology about this subject, or I'm doing an anthology about that subject. And even though I can't always say yes, probably the majority of the time I can't say yes. But I always wanted to be writing prose, even when I was writing scripts, even when I was avoiding working on my novel because it was difficult emotionally to work on that novel. I wanted my fingertips in some kind of prose writing, and I would use these editor requests as personal prompts, like, oh, wouldn't it be fun to write a story about a character who's a monster? Wouldn't it be fun to write a story about this or that? And I realized over time, oh, I have a lot of new short stories. I guess it's time for another collection.
Now, part of what you were saying there is about, you're trying to also make it in TV, and you have like a budding career there in TV and film. And you're also writing these short stories. Now, I'm from Boston and I live in Boston, and all the writers I know are basically from Boston. And, like what never happens in Boston is somebody saying like, oh, I'm just kind of torn between like this pitch I got to do for TV and like, some producers calling me. It's like, it's just all, for better or for worse, it's just all about books and literature up here. Pretty much Boston's a very pure place in that regard. Certainly in the circles that I run in. And I just wonder like how that feels to be out in LA, because like, I mean, Massachusetts is sort of like in many ways, sort of like it has a lot of intellectual gravitas, and there's like so many famous writers are here, and there's so much history here. But out in LA, like as a prose writer, I think personally, if I was out there, I would just feel like so overshadowed by this like massive global industry. And I'm just wondering, like, do you feel that way, or do you still have this feeling that like literature is supreme?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. I might have answered that question differently a few years ago. I hardly even know where to begin. I guess the one thing I will say that any published author, whether it's a short story or a novel, has what's called IP, intellectual property, and intellectual property fuels Hollywood. There were statistics that 50% of films were adaptations at one point. I don't know if that's still true. Seems like more of them are remakes. But that means that from time to time, you, as a very pure literary writer, will have a producer approaching you and saying, can I option your short story? I'd like to try to turn it into a TV series. I'd like to turn it into a film. And the first thing you need to realize is that's a long way between that and actually having a TV series or having a film. Here I am, 20 whatever years later. My first adaptation was a short story, The Lake, in Horror Noir, that came out in 2022. So it was a long, long, long wait. And I did not imagine myself as a screenwriter. when I first started writing, I was living in Miami. So, and there were a lot of South Florida authors, although even there, Cara Hyacin, Dave Barry, I mean, some of the South Florida writers were also flirting with the TV side. But yeah, here's the bottom line. Two things are very important. One, as a bystander, it was a very dissatisfying experience for me to watch producers go off and try to adapt my stuff, and then it never happened. And I realized, oh, this is falling apart at the script stage. And somewhat naively, I thought, well, if I learn how to write screenplays, I can really help shepherd these projects along. And the reason that's naive is that Hollywood wants nothing to do with this, the original author, or traditionally has wanted nothing to do. Like, watch the movie adaptation. And it's a perfect example. Like the screenwriter doesn't even want to talk to the author. You know, it's like, so that was the way it was. But even so, I didn't know any better. And I married Stephen Barnes, who already had experience in television. He'd done The Outer Limits and Twilight Zone back in the 80s. So I just saw it as an opportunity to have a seat at the table. That was my whole point, is I was tired of people not showing me scripts. I was tired, and this happened even just recently, within the past 3 or 4 years, where a project was under option and I never saw a script. I was never able to give any degree of input. And it's so frustrating. So what's happening now is that because of the 1-2 punch of, I'd say, Jordan Peele's Get Out, which really opened up Hollywood's eyes to the power of Black horror and marginalized horror to reach an audience. And also on the literary side, there's just this barrage of amazing new writers like Johnny Compton, who wrote The Spite House, and Victor Laval, who's been doing it for a very long time. There's a new environment where the author is invited to the table, where the author can be a co-showrunner. Well, they will pair you with a more experienced showrunner, because there's this drive for authenticity, own voices, authentic voices, being driven by market demands, not by just the goodness of people's hearts. It's been driven by market demands. And this brings me to my last point, everyone. I think screenwriting is just a smart thing for everyone to learn. I think it's a smart thing for prose writers to learn, because it helps you train yourself to write stories visually. Theoretically, you should be able to turn the volume down in a movie and still follow it. That's how I first saw The Ring. The first time I saw The Ring, Ringu, was in Japanese. I did not speak, and I still don't, and I could not read the subtitles. So we watched that whole movie beginning to end, having no idea what anybody was saying, and it scared the crap out of us. And that was the first time I realized, oh, that old adage about how you should be able to turn down the volume and still follow the movie is absolutely true. So it's very good for training visual storytelling, and it is so much more lucrative. Okay, you can make tens of thousands of dollars for a 3-page outline in Hollywood. Whereas, I mean, don't get me started, in publishing, it's up and down. I've had huge advances, I've had small advances.
Right.
But there's an organization called the WGA, the Writers Guild of America, which just went on strike today, as a matter of fact, that makes sure that screenwriters get paid minimum standards across the board. And that there's no other union like that exists for any kind of writers with that kind of power in the country, except the WGA. So it's a very difficult field to enter, notoriously difficult. People have lost years and their peace of mind trying to break down those walls. But if you have the temperament for rejection, and you can look at every script you write as a learning tool or a writing sample, rather than the thing that's going to buy your house, then it can be, I think it's a great undertaking to learn screenwriting. And I still love, I was just torn. I know I'm answering this question forever, but I'm working on a script right now called Bear Creek Lodge, which is an expansion of a short story that's in The Wishing Pool called Incident at Bear Creek Lodge. And that short story is the backstory. And I always knew I wanted to write a longer story. And I was really torn about, should I write it as a novel? Should I write it as a script? I mean, down to the wire, I couldn't decide which way to go. And I went novel. I mean, I went script. I went script at the last second, because A, I can write it faster. B, I can start shopping it faster as a script. And C, I can always go back and write it as a novel.
So much in there. And just to pick out a few things of what I heard, I mean, one is that for me personally, like, I'm not a screenwriter now, and I don't plan to be anytime soon, but I will say this. I love listening to screenwriters talk about storytelling, and I love reading books about storytelling by screenwriters and people who are in that business, because I just feel like the focus on not just visual storytelling, but causal storytelling, and just sort of structure, and like one thing has to lead to another, and you have to stick the landing, and there has to be these tentpole beats and everything. I just feel like writers of literature and prose often see books as doing more than, or something different than, or something in addition to telling the story, whereas it's so laser focused on storytelling in screenwriting. But the one thing I wanted to also pick up on what you said and hear your response to is, I heard you in an interview recently talk about how one of the best things to do for a writer, or the most fortunate situation for a writer to be in, is when you are financially secure. And what you said was, like, it helps you create an authentic vision, a complete vision, a better artistic vision, if you're not sort of like depending on, like, this screenplay's just gotta sell, or this, this book has gotta sell. I've got to like pay the next month's rent with this thing I'm working on. I don't think this is talked about very often. Can you just talk about that relationship between what you might call like the best kind of creativity and a sense of kind of like financial stability?
I'm happy to talk about that, because I think you're right. I think writers and all artists, frankly, don't share enough information about the financial side. It's not something that comes up often in MFA programs, because so I made a decision, a very conscious decision a few years ago, that I did not want to be a full-time writer anymore. That had been my whole dream. I worked for the Miami Herald newspaper for 10 years as a journalist. And the whole time I was there, I was focused on liberating myself through my fiction, so I wouldn't have to work a day job anymore. And I did that. I accomplished that dream, and I did that for about 15 years. But I also married another author. So while that has huge advantages, and I wouldn't trade it for the world, the one disadvantage is the financial insecurity, the lack of the ability to forecast. How much are you going to make next year? How much are you going to make this year? It takes a very steady temperament to be able to deal with, like, sort of a steady state, like you have a steady state emotionally, whether you have $50 in the bank or $50,000 in the bank. And you're the same person no matter what. It's just, and it's not for everyone. So for learning writers, as I call them, I think it's important to balance how much security matters to you versus freedom. And one of my short stories on the wishing pool is actually about that, the security versus freedom attachment. Wait, what is the name of that story? God dog it. I have so many stories in there. It's one of my Naima stories. It takes place in the future. And Naima appears in both of my collections. So I get confused about which story is which. But one of her stories as an old woman is she has to make the choice about whether it's more important for her to be free or more important to be secure. And, try it. If you want to quit your day job, I would say have a couple years savings set aside and go for it. But just know that that second year, you will spend a lot of that time looking for your next job, probably. Because even if you sell your book, they only pay you in increments. You get paid like often. I mean, it used to be like I had a publisher where it was one amount on signing, one amount on publication, one amount or hardcover or signing, acceptance of the manuscript, hardcover publication, and then paperback publication. That's a year later. So they spread, it seemed like a lot of money, but when you spread it out over all those steps, it's really not that much money, and it is very hard to plan. And at a certain point, I really felt like it's my inner child who creates these stories. It's my inner 10-year-old who creates these stories. And I felt like I had my inner 10-year-old out working the streets to support me, my adult self, while I'm sitting at home eating bonbons and watching TV. And so I started teaching part-time at Antioch University almost 10 years, really 10 years ago. I was doing that. But now I teach part-time at UCLA. And I love it. I love both teaching and the security of knowing that if this script sells or doesn't sell, if this book sells or doesn't sell, we still have a base income that doesn't change. And believe me, there's a lot to be said for that.
And it helps the art, would you say?
Tremendously. Like Bear Creek Lodge is a perfect example. It's what's called a spec script. And a
Mm-hmm.
spec script is just something you write for fun on your own. There's no one asking for it, believe me. But you're writing it because you just want to tell this story. And then of course, you're going to pin a few dreams on it. You're going to send it to your agent, or you submit it to contests, but you can't be fixed on the outcome. I'm not expecting this script to make me any amount of money in the short term. The last time I wrote a spec script, it turned into a graphic novel, which is amazing. It's called The Keeper, and it just came out last year. I co-wrote that with Stephen Barnes, and the illustrator is Marco Finnegan. That started as a spec script that I thought I was going to place with my favorite horror director's production company. And then we found out his parent company said no. So it went from it's about to go fly to the moon to it's not flying anywhere. But it is a graphic novel. And because there's this level of uncertainty about where a script will end up, and I will say, as a prose writer, it is a bit disheartening, because when you write prose, like say with my first collection, Ghost Summer, if I hadn't been able to find a house to publish it, I would have just published it myself. I would have hired an editor, commissioned an artist to make a cover, thrown it up on probably Amazon somewhere. You always have the option to self-publish in prose. With screenplays, nobody wants to read a screenplay. Even other screenwriters don't want to read your screenplay for the most. You have to have a friendship for that to happen. You can't just shove a script at someone and say, read this. So there is this sense of kind of writing into the void that to me is even more acute than when you're writing prose, because there's no guarantee your prose will sell. But like I said, you can always just publish it yourself.
Right. All right. So I have so much I want to get through. It's so easy to talk to you. The time just sort of slips away. But let's talk for a moment just about the Wishing Pool. Let's talk about this collection of stories. So first I want to talk about horror tropes. Okay. So let me just set up my question for a moment. So there are the thing about all tropes of all kinds and all cliches of all kinds is that they're just really great ideas that continue to work even when they're reused, even when we recognize them. And so some great horror tropes are like a creaking door, or you see somebody in the back watching the main character, but the main character doesn't see them, or a cabin in the woods, or a scary basement, right? These things, even though you've seen them a million times, they still have this subconscious power.
It's like you're reading my script. How'd you get them?
Right. But so it's funny. So in the very first story, The Wishing Pool, it was great because I found a kind of like a newer trope, which is like still works, and it works every time you see it. And it is when you drive to someplace out in the woods and your cell phone doesn't have service anymore. Like that is like, you do see that a fair amount, but that's
like, just reality though. When you drive out in the woods, your cell phone doesn't work anymore.
It's exactly right. It's exactly right. So anyway, but I love horror. Horror is just like one of the most tropey genres. It's one of the strictest genres in terms of kind of like what the audience is expecting and so on. And anyway, I guess my question here to you is like, what really scares you? And are there certain tropes that like are particularly even just still get you?
Oh, wow. Good questions. There's a little bit of everything that scares me in this collection, like the Wishing Pool, the titular story. I'm afraid of loss, right? So my father is 88 years old, and during COVID, I hadn't seen him for almost 2 years when I was going to visit for the first time. And I wrote the first story, The Wishing Pool, to prepare myself for seeing my father, for like how much he might have changed, how much he might have diminished, how much weaker he might be. Would he even know me? Was like really know me, not my name or whatever, but would he remember? So I put all of that anxiety into my story. And, without too much of a spoiler, I'd love to say that my real life visit turned out to be way better. And it's been a while since I wrote that story. And my dad, I still visit him on Alexa, and I'll be seeing him at the end of the month. And thank goodness it's not what Joya, the character in that story, is going through. So that's one thing. All the stuff in the story scares me. History scares me, which is why with Thursday Night Shift, I have a story set in history, an important event in 1968 that so many of us wish we could revisit and wish we could interact with. But there's always a cost, for anything that happens with history that you try to interact with. So that's that story. In terms of like tropiness and the kind of like ghosts, the reformatory is a ghost story. It's a haunted reformatory. There's a ghost or two probably in the wishing pool. But I think the horror trope that scares me the most would be demons. Demons, which I guess in the language of one of the characters in my story, Rumpus Room, would be what we would call an abomination. That is just like, it's such an abomination, you can hardly name it. And I always make the joke, you're talking about creaking. Like last night I was alone in our house, which is it's not a haunted house, it's just a regular house, but I had the bedroom doors closed. And for some reason, maybe because of the air conditioner or something, the door it kept rattling like someone was trying to get in. And I'm like, I'm the only one here. And I locked it, right? Because so there's a reason that's scary. But in every movie you've ever seen where someone is hearing that rattling door or hearing that thumping sound and they're first going to investigate, they're going, hello? Like, please pick up a weapon before you do that. But anyway, you better hope it's a ghost, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because ghosts, at least through my interpretation, I did meet someone who felt like they had a ghost in their house who used to like trip them on the stairs. Like it would feel like you were crossing an invisible string when they went down the stairs. So ghosts, maybe they're mischievous. Yeah, I guess ultimately in Ringu, the ring, it's kind of a ghost, but it's really more like a demon. And that's the difference. A ghost just wants to be recognized. A ghost wants their story told. A demon, pardon my French, will ride your ass for generations. And if you have a demon in your house, you have a big problem. It is an intergenerational problem. It is a problem that just saying, I recognize you. Oh, I'm so sad about what happened to you. That's not going to cut it. Okay.
Now, and I have to ask, when you're writing these stories, do you feel like these are metaphors for psychology, or do you genuinely believe in demons?
Good question. I primarily do feel like they're metaphors. I don't actually believe in demons. Ghosts, I'm kind of on the fence about because so many earnest people have told me such interesting stories. I just have a hard time discounting so much anecdotal evidence. And there are a lot of cultures where they feel that ancestors and ghosts are with them. And it's only in our sort of American and Western culture where we consider that strictly horror movie kind of material. So ghosts, maybe, demons, not so much. But even so, because I've never had any experiences really remotely like the ones I write about, which is probably the reason I feel comfortable writing about it, I do consider a lot of this to be metaphor. Like Bear Creek Lodge, incident at Bear Creek Lodge, I don't want to give it away, but there's something in the snow that is related to intergenerational trauma. And the thing in the snow is kind of metaphorical. I mean, it's real in the story, but for me as the writer, it serves as a kind of a symbol of kind of a devil's bargain that a character has made and what the cost of that devil's bargain was.
Another aspect of your story that people talk about a lot is the endings. This morning, I mean, after having read the book, I was like looking through, I love to do this, just look through Goodreads reviews and get the real raw hot takes, and
better you than me. I don't
right. No, I read them, so you don't have to. So a lot of the talk is around how you end stories and how it seems that the stories end a beat before one might expect. The resolution of the story seems to be, it's not in the story, but it's like the reader can feel it or guess what it is. But I'm just curious about, what do you think about endings? Why do you choose to end stories where they are? How do you choose when to end a story, and so on?
That is a great question. And yeah, wow, a lot of thoughts going through my mind. It's hard for me to look at my own work in terms of why I end or how I end, because for me, that feels like the perfect place to end. And often the perfect place to end is that thing that's just around the corner that the character can see, but you, the reader, might not be able to see. So you have to sort of guess what it is. It reminds me, like way back when I first started publishing, Joyce Carol Oates published a collection. I wish I could remember the name of it or the name of the story. So I'm just going to be mangling this whole reference. but it was set at Christmas. And there was a very strong sense I had that if the characters opened up these Christmas presents, they were going to be filled with disembodied body parts. Okay. I don't know why I thought that. And I never got to see them, but she had set the story up so that that was what I thought was just about to happen. And there is something about the thing you can't quite see that makes it even scarier sometimes than me spelling it all out for you. It's why I think smart horror directors often have the creature in shadow until like the perfect moment. If you're just looking at like a full 7-foot creature from the very first, like if they had just shown us Alien at the beginning of the movie Alien, that wouldn't have been nearly as scary as just seeing little pieces of the alien. And then there's this exhibition toward the end of the story that's scarier because we haven't been like, if we've been watching this thing all throughout the movie, that's not as scary at all.
Right.
But what makes it horror is the unknown. And I do think some of my stories, not all of them, I mean, some of them are quite final in the way they end. Like the biographer, the last story, pretty much is very cut and dry at the end. Some stories do ask the reader to anticipate what's going to happen based on what they know about the character, what they know about the situation. I would say my short story Migration is one of those stories. Like there's a character who's going home. Now it's up to you to decide what you think is going to happen when the character gets home. But just based on that, what have you seen come before in this story?
Right.
And that gives you a good idea of what will be happening when she gets there.
I love it. I want to pivot to another topic, which is about race and representation in fiction. And I was saying to you in the green room that I had actually met you at a conference. Maybe this has got to be, it was the SFWA Nebula Awards conference in LA, maybe around 2019, because it was before COVID,
right?
But like right before COVID. And you had this kind of coffee clatch session where everybody could come in and just ask you anything. And at that point, I was in the beginning of stages of writing this book of mine, which is now going to come out next spring. It's called Paul Bunyan and the Beautiful Destiny, but it's about this friendship between Paul Bunyan, who's white, and the black steel driving man, John Henry. And I was deeply anxious at that moment in the early stages of this project. I had lots of personal reasons for wanting to write that particular kind of story, but I'm certainly aware of how hard the winds are blowing right now around this issue of race and representation. And as a white man trying to write not just a black character, but a famous black folklore hero, how fraught that might be. And I went to you with this basket of anxieties. And I remember feeling very reassured by what you told me, which I'm boiling it down, and you will have a chance to correct the record if this is not me quoting you accurately. But you basically said, look, we're at a moment in our culture where our culture is asking people for more, or asking storytellers to write in a more diverse way. That same culture then cannot just crush everybody who tries to do it. And so basically what I took from that is kind of go forth and do the job well, do it thoroughly, do it to the best of your ability, and then just kind of hope for the best. But anyway, it was an encouraging comment that you made to me. And I just kind of wanted to use that as a jumping off point to just kind of give the floor back to you and just talk about this issue and maybe how it's changed over the last few years, where we're at now in that conversation. And really, what is your advice to white writers who, and again, acknowledging that white writers have had quite a good run and a lopsided run for a very long time.
And still will.
And still will. Yeah. But at the same time, white writers, and I can tell you just from having white writer friends that like, this is something that is going on, that people are like, I want to do something and write a character outside my own experience, but I feel so afraid of being basically pilloried for doing it the wrong way.
Well, that's a great question. And, on the Hollywood side, which I'll address really quickly, even though you didn't ask about it, what's happening now is that writers' rooms are diversifying because they want the writers' room to match the cast more closely, right? So it's not just a room like the Jeffersons. I couldn't believe it the first time as a kid. I saw a picture of the writers' room for the Jeffersons, and it was a bunch of old white guys. I was literally shocked. I had no idea that was wild. How Hollywood was run. But until pretty much the day before yesterday, that is how Hollywood was run. It's only very recently that there's more attention to, we should have a Black director. We should have representation in the writer's room. But when you're a solitary writer, when you're a novelist, you're a short story writer, yes, there is this push for what's called writing the other, is exactly what you're talking about. And it's not just white writers. I would say any writer who is writing about people different from themselves is writing the other. And when you're writing the other, the most harmful thing you can do is assume, oh, I've got this. Like, I've got this. I watch TV, I watch movies. I've got this. That's like the worst. And please don't base it on TV and movies, because, like I said, until just recently, that is not the example. And even when you do have diversity in the room, there's a flattening sometimes of marginalized characters. It just happens through the system. The editor doesn't want to have a love scene between these two Black characters because it's pushing some kind of weird button for them. You don't know. So it's the purest form when it's just you. And the key is, first of all, to have a diverse life, to have friends from different backgrounds. And hopefully that's why that you've chosen like when I was a developing writer, one of the first novels I was writing out of grad school was about a white queer male character, because I had a lot of queer male friends. And for some reason, I wasn't seeing myself in my own work yet as a Black woman. That's a whole different story. So I was drawn to the marginalization of queerness. And that to me was kind of like a parallel to race in a way that made sense to me. But I ran out, even with the people I knew, I ran out of I just was too young. I was too inexperienced. I was reaching too far for characters who were nothing like me, like a queer playwright who lives in New York and is estranged from his brother. I don't have a brother. I've never lived in New York. I'm not a playwright. If I had chosen someone more like me, I might have been able to pull it off. So sometimes just having the diverse life isn't enough if you've bitten off a little bit more than you can chew. So what happens then? Well, that's what beta readers are for. And I would suggest that writers pay people, yeah, your friends will read it for you sometimes, but even your friends are not necessarily the best readers because they like you, right? They're just so happy for you that you finished your book. And I would say that just one reader is not enough, because there will be disagreements about things. And even Harlan Ellison, the late great science fiction writer Harlan Ellison, came to Steve, my husband, because he was writing a story with a Black protagonist and he wanted to make sure there was nothing offensive or tropey. I mean, I think what we don't understand is that all of us as consumers of media, whether it's books, television, or film, have preconceived notions of how other communities are based on what we've seen. A quick example would be coming from Miami, which has a very large Cuban American population that was a professional class before they moved to the United States. My stereotype of what Latinos were like is your boss. Okay, they're everywhere. It's like all woven throughout society. And I was very confused by Hollywood movies that only depicted Spanish-speaking characters as gardeners and cooks and housekeepers. I was like, where's that coming from? From my experience in Miami, we didn't have gardeners. Okay, we couldn't afford gardeners in Miami. Everyone in LA has gardeners. That is because there's a difference in having working class immigrants who work for less money, and that dynamic isn't the same in Miami. So we're all influenced. Clearly, these screenwriters were just writing what they knew. So that's where you get in trouble. Write what you think you know will get you in trouble when you're writing the other. I can absolutely guarantee you that you don't know as much as you think you do. And this goes for all writers. So like, for instance, with my book, The Good House, which I published back in like 2003, there's some indigenous folklore and an indigenous character in there. And I did some book research. If I were writing that today, number one, I might even just stay away from that aspect entirely, because it's not that I had a haunted Native American burial ground, that kind of close. But at the very least, I would have had a beta reader to give me more than what I've seen, more than what I've imagined. Just even if it's just a little very specific cultural touch that I would never think of and wouldn't be in a book, it adds value and authenticity to your work. You just want those characters to be three-dimensional. That's the thing. Is their psychology as rigid and as well explored as the character who is like you? Sometimes you even have to ask why you want that marginalized character in your work, right? Because
Right.
there are such tropes like the magical Negro. And when I was teaching in my MFA program, I had a student with some Native American characters where it seemed to me that they only existed to be magical.
Mm.
So you have to sort of interrogate, why are you even including this character? What do they want? What's
Right.
in it for them to talk to this white protagonist? And as long as you are very thorough about it, quizzing yourself, interrogating yourself, finding your beta readers, you'll probably do fine.
And I think another thing that I feel like I've come across is the advice like, make sure that that character has a life outside this interaction with the white character, right? Like they
Exactly.
don't, because you might just say, oh, well, it's a given that they have a life outside of it, but you can tell if the character is only drawn in such a way that they are serving the story end of the protagonist, right?
Yes.
Rather than seeming to have a rich life that sort of will be full the moment they leave this white protagonist orbit, you know?
Yeah, that's one of the things that drives me crazy in film and television, and I assume in books, but I don't see it as often, is the marginalized character in isolation. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's a group of friends, there's this one black friend, but the one black friend, oh, Stranger Things, perfect example, season 1. Who was the black kid's family in season 1? We went home with every other character
Mm.
except the black kid. Season 1, now they fixed it, but I can almost guarantee you there were notes, there were people who noticed, there was feedback, and they're like, oh, we forgot, you know,
Yep.
we forgot to give the black character a life. And that happens unconsciously. I remember the actor Blair Underwood telling me that way back on LA Law. I'm dating all of us with that one. But he was the black partner at the law firm. Everybody else had a home life and an apartment. And the writers would say, well, we don't know what. It's like,
Right.
well, you start with he's a human, so he has the same kinds of issues that other characters have. But even beyond that, and there is an online course, writingtheother.com, tons of material for whatever kind of like queer characters, overweight characters. Believe me, you have stereotypes. Like whale is such a trope of sort of the tragic obese person trope.
Right.
I haven't even
Right.
seen it,
Right.
but I'm just guessing that that's what it is because the people who made it are not overweight.
Yep.
So they're just imagining what's going on with this character, and you got to do your homework.
Right. All right. So incredibly, it's been 40 minutes, and
Wow.
so we might just go like 5 minutes over or something because I just need to get into the whole Jordan Peele side of the discussion,
Oh, sure.
which is so great. So you teach at UCLA. You teach a course called The Sunken Place. I'm just going to give a quick thumbnail sketch of that. It's about the film, the Oscar-winning film Get Out, the revolutionary, famous, game-changing film Get Out, one of the great
My
films in the
poster
last.
behind me.
Right, and there's Jordan Peele right there over your shoulder. And he's come into your class and surprised your class, and we're going to put footage in the chat of that amazing moment, which can be found on YouTube. So I want to talk about a little bit about Jordan Peele and just sort of the Jordan Peele moment in our culture. But first, I'm just dying to ask, when you saw Get Out for the first time, can you just summarize what it was like and what was going through your mind when you walked out of that theater?
I would love to. I love to revisit that moment, you know, from the trailer. My mouth was hanging open because as a
Wow.
horror fan, I so rarely see horror with a black protagonist. And it was clear not just that he was a black protagonist, but when they showed the child sitting on the bed sink into the floor and this whole fantasy aspect opened up, I was like, oh my God, not only is this a black protagonist, but this is a very thoughtful story that's actually about something. So that's how I went in. I went in with high expectations. And I have to admit, my husband and I wanted to go into LA because we lived out in the suburbs. Um, and we wanted to see it in a black theater where people will be talking back to the screen and, you know, that whole full experience because I might want to talk to the screen too. But our
By the way,
babysitter
I saw it with
counselor.
like an all-white audience, and they were yelling at the screen too. By the way, I think
Okay, well,
everybody was
great.
yelling at this movie.
Okay, good. So we ended up seeing it in Glendora, California. We were the only black people in the theater, which was not my
Oh
plan.
wow.
So I was a little conscious of the
Mm.
fact that there was this white dude sitting next to me. And I was so busy wondering what he was thinking about what he was watching that sometimes it pulled me out of the movie. But beyond that, I noticed that he was just into it. He was cheering for Chris, just like I was cheering for Chris, and that Peele had managed to create this super sympathetic protagonist that audience members of all kinds would relate to. And it wasn't even, I mean, maybe it was less about race for this guy next to me. Like, I'm seeing all kinds of messages about white supremacy and cultural appropriation and Black history with Jesse Owens. And oh my God, there's cotton. Although I did miss the cotton in the ears reference. But I was seeing a lot deeper messaging maybe than the guy next to me. Maybe he was just watching it more on the surface, enjoying it as a film. But the fact is, we both loved it, and that film made $250 million. And you don't do that just reaching a Black audience. So it reached a wide audience, and it was pretty unforgettable. And I must have seen it at least a dozen times by now.
Just a complete masterpiece. But I have to take a moment and inject that, like, I feel like I'm in a very small minority here, that I think that Sorry to Bother You might, for my lights, be a better film. Or it's like, to say better is just odd because they're just so different.
They're very different.
They're just so different. But I mean, like, Sorry to Bother You to me is like I say it's like an unsung masterpiece. I mean, it was sung, but I feel like it should have won like 10 Oscars. I mean, to me, it was just a totally landmark film, a smart film. It was there were so many ideas in that film. It was so funny. I just cannot get over that film. And I just always feel like I can't quite ever find anybody who feels as passionately about that movie as I do.
I just watched it last night again because I'm teaching it in my Afrofuturism class literally as soon as I get off of this call. So the podcast. And I agree, it's brilliant. I think it definitely should have won more awards. It should have been nominated for more awards. I mean, it has this kind of gonzo rather energy, like here, there, and everywhere. And then every once in a while it parks at a moment that is just completely true. Like, whoa, that is so well said, Stephen Yeun's character, that if there's a problem that we feel like we're insufficiently equipped to handle, we pretend it isn't there. That is so true. Or the scene where Lakeith Stanfield's character, Cassius, is asked to rap at his boss's house. It's like, oh my God, that is so true. The whole using a white voice, which to me in the real world is about code switching, which is something, Black people do all the time. That is also so true. So I do love that film, and I see new things every time I watch it. And I do agree, it's fantastic.
It's fantastic. All right. So as we're wrapping up here, it's the time has just flown by, but I just want to ask you quickly, if you can, because we're running out of time. Like, can you just talk about this kind of Jordan Peele moment? It seems like there's a kind of a before and after moment in our storytelling culture around that film. We've seen a lot of film, like Sorry to Bother You. There was a show, Them, on Amazon. There was someone named Erin Adams, a debut author I had named Erin Adams, wrote a book called Jackal. I had her on my show recently. But this is just, you could go on and on with all.
It's a great book.
She's
another one who came out of nowhere, So,
right?
Yeah, the Jordan Peele moment, there is like a JP and AJP
Right.
Before and after, because, listen, I was in Hollywood, at least at the fringes, trying to pitch Black horror from the early 2000s, and just blank faces. People, the clearest reference they had was Beloved, Jonathan Demme's movie starring Oprah Winfrey, based on the Toni Morrison novel, which I also teach that in my Black horror class. But it's a super tough film to watch, and more importantly, it did not make a lot of money at the box office. So nobody wanted to hear comparisons that reminded them of Beloved. And then Get Out comes out. So all of a sudden you have a profitable Black horror movie that was just this clear vocabulary. And it was almost overnight, the difference. Just as a quick example, the documentary Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror, which is still on Shudder, got the green light the day Jordan Peele won his Oscar. The day. Wow. Because it's almost like, oh, Black horror. Like, right. Oh, like we understand what that means now. And I don't think a lot of people understand that also it's not just Black horror that has had a turn in the sun since Get Out, but all kinds of marginalized horror, even to the point where the lead in the latest Scream movie is Latina, right? There's a lot more marginalized horror of all kinds. I just watched a movie last night that was just casually queer horror. I can't remember the name of it, but it's the two women. Yeah, actually, they were lesbians now that I think about it. But it wasn't the point so much the way the point is in Jordan Peele's first movie. And if you'll notice in Us and Nope, race is not the point in the same way it was even with Get Out, but it's opening the door for all kinds of storytellers to tell their stories in their ways. And that works so great for horror, because the one thing horror fans love is novelty. You literally can't be as scared by something you've literally seen 100 times before. But if the demon has a different mythology, it's not the Roman Catholic version of a demon, but there's like a Thai demon, or there's just a demon from another culture. That's scary. And we're all those 10-year-old kids who just want to be scared. And often that means it has to be something new and fresh, or at least feel new and fresh. And marginalized horror gives horror fans that. It's like a perspective you've never thought about, a haunting you've never thought about. I'm just so happy and I feel very lucky to be both publishing and writing screenplays in such a rich era for horror.
And you've said also that, I mean, your parents are famous, leaders in the civil rights movement, and you've talked in that context about kind of the horrors of civil rights and what Black people had to go through, and how speculative genre, horror genre is a way to process that cultural trauma. And I think like that's one of the amazing things about it too. It's not just that it's fresh in all the ways that you're just saying, but also, a show like Them on Amazon, which is about redlining and about housing. And then there's just, as you said about the white voice in Sorry to Bother You, it's about code switching, right? There's a way, it's like we are talking about it without talking about it. We're making you pay attention to this thing, and we're teaching you about it, but we're not naming it, and you're just learning about it kind of in a different way through this genre. And I just love that about some of these films.
I have just a quick piece of advice for creators about that, because there's a thin line between horror that is enriched by true life racial history, sort of through the looking glass, and horror that presents lynching as horror. And I think when we get to the lynching as horror piece, and this is something that not just marginalized creators fall into, but I think sometimes allies think, oh, here's a way to address racism. Let's show this terrible racist thing happening to this person. Well, that's pulling me out of the movie now sometimes. The reason I can watch Get Out over and over again is because no one in my family was ever abducted into like a body snatching ring. It's a fantasy premise. All the racial stuff is hanging around it, but it's not literally triggering, oh my God, that's exactly what happened to my grandfather.
Right.
Oh, that's what happened to my teenage son when he got pulled over by the police. Yeah, all that stuff is scary and all that stuff is real. Like some people say the scariest part to Get Out for them is when Andre's character, played by Lakeith Stanfield, is walking through those white suburbs lost, because that's like, oh, that happened to me. That is scary. But then we move away from that quickly into the fantasy realm. So I would just tell creators, sometimes you want to avoid that impulse to portray racialized horror as the thing itself. And I struggled with that with the Reformatory, because it's set in 1950, Jim Crow. I mean, racism is one of the monsters, but it's not really the primary monster. It's a ghost story. And I hope and I believe that the more you have a fantasy element through which your viewer or reader can experience the story, like from a little bit of a distance. That's why people like my late mother, Patricia Stevens Due, who was tear gassed in 1960 and wore dark glasses her whole life. She loved horror, but I doubt very seriously that she would have loved horror if movie after movie was about Black people being lynched, Black people being hurt, Black people being hunted by white people. That was, in fact, never what she was watching. It was always through a fantasy prism. So the ghosts, the monsters, the zombies, the demons are stand-ins for that real thing that you're trying to distract yourself from. And that entertainment, which horror is, can help relieve some of that pressure. It helps you escape from it so that you do feel a little bit stronger, like that final girl or that person who survived, or even if they didn't survive, that person who gave their all in that movie impart some of their strength to you without having to be re-traumatized by horror that feels too much like life.
So well said, and I just could not agree more. It's just sort of a slant way to look at something truly awful, which is almost too awful to behold
Yeah.
in its reality. Like Medusa, you kind of have to look in a mirror or something to see
Yeah,
it.
it's just out of the corner of your eye,
Right,
not dead
right.
into the face
That's
of
right.
it.
All right, and The Reformatory, your novel, is coming out in October, is it?
October 31st, Halloween, everybody.
That's terrific.
Yes.
All right, that's great. Just any other quick pitch you want to make about The Reformatory?
It's based on some true life family history, which is why it was so hard and so difficult for me to write, but I have completely fictionalized it. And it's basically about a 12-year-old boy who is unjustly sent to a segregated reformatory for 6 months that happens to be haunted. And over the course of the novel, he realizes that the haints are the least of his problem. And in fact, it's possible to even perhaps have a friendship with one, but watch your back.
Watch your back, baby. That sounds so exciting. And I love that this book is just sort of, The Wishing Pool is sort of a tease for that. Got you on everybody's radar again. Last question for the interview before we wrap. I ask every author who comes on the show. So imagine, if you will, the ideal reader for The Wishing Pool, somebody who's just kind of getting the book in just the way you hoped it would be gotten, picking up everything you're putting down. And imagine they finish this collection of stories and they're sitting there. They look out the window. Describe in a phrase or even a word, what is the feeling that this reader has?
A little bit jarred to your bones, because I mean, come on, it's horror. Every horror writer wants that for your readers, but also a little bit hopeful. There's slivers of hope throughout these stories, and hopefully that you've discovered a new writer that you want to read everything they've ever written.
I love that. Perfect ending, perfect answer. Tananarive Due, this has been such a pleasure. I have a lot of guests on my show, but I have to say few are so easy to talk to as you have been. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been great. So folks, the link to buy Tananarive's book, The Wishing Pool, is in the chat. Again, her next book, her novel, The Reformatory, comes out on Halloween of this year in just a few months. So please keep a lookout for that. And we'll see you next week on The Thoughtful Bro. Tananarive Due, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.